It's a beautiful afternoon here in Louisville, Kentucky. Operation Parent and I, Michelle Massey, are so excited that you're here with us to learn today. As your host, let me walk you through the features of our new system, Webinar Geek. All attendees will be muted during this presentation. We would, however, love to hear from you via the private chat section. You will send both questions and comments privately here, including the questions, your most favorite part, the questions at the end for Phyllis. Any handouts for this webinar were sent to you prior to this presentation, and you can also click on the arrow and view them live with us here. You've got one handout today, and it is the PDF of the slides. Want to let you know, like our previous webinars, for those of you who are joining us again, we are recording this one, and the recording will be sent out in email in the next 5 hours. For those of you who are joining us live, you're going to also receive a certificate of attendance within 5 hours as well. You will be sent those things in a separate email from the recording. There will be a brief survey at the end of this presentation. It's only going to take you about 2 minutes to complete the survey. And please know that we are thankful for everyone who's done that in the past. Your very generous feedback helps us guide this webinar program and give you exactly what you want. We welcome all feedback, constructive criticism, anything that you would like to let us know in that survey. And please know that we utilize every word of it. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Phyllis Fagell. She's a licensed mental health therapist and a certified school counselor. She's also the author of Middle School Superpowers, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today and go deeply into 5 of those superpowers. She's been a contributor to the Washington Post, CNN, U.S. News and World Report, the Chicago Tribune, and NPR. But most importantly, she's got incredible experience working with teens every day. And she is so much fun to work with, and it's just going to give us so much hope-filled advice to share. Phyllis, we're so thankful to be with you today, and we can't wait to hear what you're going to teach us.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and it's wonderful to be here today teaming up with Operation Parent. I keep waiting to get tired of talking about middle school, but I don't think I ever will, because it is a phase that is so distinct and so fun to work with and so interesting to research and talk about. When I was a new school counselor, and I had worked in an elementary school, I had worked in a high school, I thought for sure I would know what I was doing, since I had worked with younger kids and older kids, and was really surprised to show up and feel completely out of my depth at the same time as I also had 2 new middle schoolers in my own house. That's when I decided to go looking into the research, finding out more about middle school, and discovered there wasn't much. So I wrote Middle School Matters, which was my first book, and very much an in the weeds look at middle school. But today I'm going to be talking about middle school superpowers, and that's more of a 30,000-foot view on the phase and how we can turn out kids who, at a time that's really complicated in history, at an age that's characterized by so much change, so much turmoil, how we can turn out resilient, socially skilled, well-adjusted, kids who have executive functioning skills and all of the other interpersonal skills like self-advocacy that they need in order to be ready for high school and life beyond that. So the books are available anywhere, but again, I'm going to be talking mostly about the superpowers in middle school superpowers, or the skills that kids need in this phase that we hope that they will acquire, and the strengths that they need. I want to start by sharing kind of a look at what I think are the typical scenarios that kids are encountering, and I've tried to capture a few here. Because kids are moving on from elementary to middle, that means that they are shifting both internally and externally at a time when they're going through puberty at different phases, they're maturing at different phases, and a lot of friendships don't make it through that transition. Some of them cycle back in later, but a lot of kids are a little bit melancholy. That's why they'll tell me, we used to be good friends. I don't understand why we're not friends now. Because they're so vulnerable, they're so insecure, they're still figuring out what their identity is, they are easily embarrassed. They're much less likely to take risks. They're also not sure how to pick friends, how to define what a friend is, and may get confused about whether somebody is a school friend or a best friend or just an acquaintance. And I'll be returning to that in a little bit. Sometimes kids feel suffocated by friends that they really enjoyed hanging out with before. And because they have very little life experience, very little perspective, it's hard for them to imagine that when they have a setback, when things don't go as well as they had hoped, that they can regroup, that they can actually come out stronger for those struggles. So we as adults, whether we're parents, whether we're educators, can do a lot to help kids be resilient, be willing to continue to take those risks. So when we're thinking about kids, while there are some characteristics of the phase that I've talked about, that desire for agency, that desire for independence, that insecurity, the great sense of humor, because middle schoolers are just so funny, there is research showing that there are differences between girls and boys. And I recognize this doesn't cover everybody. It's not exhaustive research. Hopefully there will continue to be more research into gender differences. But it's important to understand that girls and boys are stopped by different challenges. Girls are much less likely to take risks if they think it might endanger one of their close relationships. So if their best friend is running for student council, they might not want to run as well and step on their toes, even if that's something they'd like to do too. They are much more likely to worry about conflict because they're afraid they'll be lonely. They don't want to hurt others. They're less likely to express anger or to risk alienating one of their friends. And they tend to struggle more with perfectionism, which can stop them in their tracks. And perfectionism is really a form of fear, and they need a lot of support figuring out how to get beyond that. Boys, on the other hand, and I think this is contrary to some of the stereotypes about the phase, they're actually more likely to be either verbally or physically bullied. They're more likely to step on the heads below them in order to get social status. They tend to travel in packs or groups rather than those smaller pairs that girls tend to prioritize. They are less likely to lean on others for help, to ask for help. And if they do have supportive friendships, they tend to be opposite sex friendships. So we need to be normalizing those close bonds with same gender friends as well, which they do want. They want those loyal friendships. And we need to be normalizing asking for help. And that's something I'm going to be returning to later as well. So there are 12 superpowers in middle school superpowers, and I wish I could talk about all of them today, but I'm going to focus on 5 that I think are really key. Super belonging is the first one, and I consider that one the most foundational, because if you don't feel like you're accepted, if you don't feel like you have a place in the pack, that you are welcomed in the environments in which you're traveling, you are not going to be able to acquire any of the other strengths in this book. Super sight is the ability to anticipate how the decisions you make today will impact whatever happens tomorrow. And that can show up in lots of different ways. It could relate to decisions around substance use or skipping class or posting something mean. It could have to do with doing work in an organized fashion so that you're not cramming at the last minute. I often have to reassure parents that kids in this age are not lazy, literally don't yet have the functioning skills they need. Those exact skills don't kick in until about age 15. Super bounce is about recovering when those inevitable setbacks or missteps happen. And again, what we want is for kids to understand that the stakes are low, that this is a phase where they should be trying lots and lots of different things, seeing where their strengths and interests intersect, and continuing to move forward if things are not going well, whether they continue with that activity or try something else. Super healing is about self-regulation, and acquiring coping skills. And again, these are practical skills that need to be operationalized for them. And that's a topic I'll be returning to today. And then last but definitely not least is super optimism. Optimists see situations as temporary and situational. Pessimists see them as pervasive and permanent. And the kids who are the most resilient are the ones who can roll with the punches, who can experience a setback and figure out how to retain that optimism and continue trying and taking those risks. So super belonging is the most foundational, as I said, and this is about making connections. And the first item on this list is probably the hardest skill for middle schoolers to acquire, and in many ways the easiest one for us to teach because you can operationalize it. When I'm helping kids learn to assume positive intent, that others didn't intend to hurt them, and we know kids will have a gentler middle school journey if they think that their peers are not out to get them, then I will play a game with them I call the maybe game. And I'll ask them to come up with 2 or 3 other possible reasons someone did something offensive, or a teacher used a sharp tone, or their parents seemed upset with them, other than, they're a bad kid, or they have no friends, or they're a loser. And I'll give you an example. I had a student, a middle school boy, who was really dejected because all of his friends, and it was a group of about 5 kids, his closest friends, who he was always hanging out with, had gotten together on the weekend without him. It was a Friday night. And he thought for sure he had done something to offend them, that he was going to be completely adrift socially. And when I asked him to do this exercise, he had a really hard time. But eventually he sat down and he thought, and he took a little piece of paper and wrote down something, and then he read it to me, and he said, maybe they didn't invite me because they all are on the same sports team and they had practice that day. And maybe they just got together afterwards, and it wasn't that they intended to exclude me. It's just that they didn't think about me at all. And then he looked up at me, and I got really lucky. He said, oh my gosh, I think that's actually what happened. And really that's what we're trying to do, help them think more expansively. And I always preface this with the caveat that I don't need them to believe the alternate reasons they come up with. In that case, I was lucky, but I'm not trying to talk them out of how they're feeling. I'm trying to teach them to think more flexibly, because once they have that skill, they can apply it to all different kinds of scenarios. Second one is meanness, bullying, or emotional discomfort. And as a school counselor, I get calls all the time from parents who want to know how to deal with the fact that their kid has been bullied, or that a friend is being mean to them. And often what I'll discover is that the situation itself is perhaps being misunderstood or even mischaracterized by the child. So when your child comes home, or when you hear a student relaying a story about something that happened that they are interpreting as bullying or meanness, ask them to share exactly what happened and listen carefully to the story, to the details of the story, because all 3 of these categories are very different. Bullying is the 3 Ps, that there's a pattern of behavior. It's not a one-off mean comment. There's a purpose, there's an intent to wound. The person is trying to make the kid feel bad. And there's a power imbalance, which could be older, younger, bigger, smaller, more social capital, less social capital. If it's truly bullying, and that's fairly rare, thankfully, what you want to be doing is asking your child for permission to get involved in ways that they're comfortable with. But odds are they're going to need that adult intervention. Meanness, on the other hand, which is more common than bullying. And I always say that if your kid has one friend, even only one friend, they are mean. Sometimes all kids are mean. Sometimes, often it's just social clumsiness. They try to be funny and it comes out as mean. But meanness, definitionally, is you've got 2 kids on equal footing, 2 friends, no power imbalance, and one says something mean to the other. Maybe the other person says something mean back. In those situations, they might need some coaching if they invite you to help them, but they don't need your direct involvement. But what I see almost 100% of the time, I would say 99% of the time, is what I would call emotional discomfort. Emotional discomfort is when a kid characterizes it as meanness or bullying, but when you listen, you realize they're simply uncomfortable. Maybe they wanted to be invited to a party and they weren't, or maybe they walked into the cafeteria and it was crowded and loud and scary, and they saw their friends at a table and had wanted them to beckon them over, but instead they didn't really acknowledge them, maybe because they were dealing with their own feelings of adjusting to this loud cafeteria. If it's emotional discomfort, what you want to be doing is trying to help them figure out ways to deal with that discomfort. So if it's the cafeteria, for example, maybe you can have a conversation with them where they find a friend who has a similar schedule and they agree to meet outside the cafeteria before they go in, or maybe they bring something to read for a few minutes until things are a little quieter and they kind of figure out who's at their table and a topic to talk about. So we're trying to help them figure out ways to handle those uncomfortable moments. We don't want to interview for pain. So when you hear those details, and it might trigger something in you, a lot of parents tell me they didn't have the best middle school experience themselves. And so you might really relate to whatever they're sharing. Try to avoid following up the next day with a comment like, was Tina mean to you again? If you start with that, I call it mining for misery or digging for dirt or interviewing for pain, that's the direction the conversation is going to go in. And you want to be having more lighter conversations and also not directing it toward that direction. They're looking for that response, but it doesn't help them. Once you have a handle on what's going on with their lives socially, you might start to realize they're often in the middle of a lot of drama. And middle schoolers are often characterized as having, a penchant for drama. I actually have found that they hate drama. They hate it if it's coming from their parents. They find it exhausting when it's coming from their peers. The issue is that they do not know how to extricate themselves from those situations. So if I have 8 or 9 kids in front of my door after some kind of unstructured time like lunch or break, I immediately will say, okay, who is here because you know what happened and you want to refute the story? And I'll say, you can leave. Who is here because you witnessed everything and you want to support your friend? You can leave. Who's here because everyone was walking in this direction and you just followed them? You can leave. And what I'm really trying to do is help them recognize that they have limited energy. They want to conserve that energy. They don't necessarily need to be involved in every last story that comes up during the school day. Going back to the idea that there's a lot of emotional discomfort, a very common scenario is that a student or a client will be upset that they were not invited to be part of something, whether it's a sleepover or a party or even a group study project. One of the things that they will often say is, I thought they were my friend. And when I listen, again, you're listening for these details, what I discover is that this is more of an acquaintance, more of a school friend. It's not somebody they've ever talked to or texted with on their own or hung out with after school. It's a school friend or an acquaintance. And the reframe for that I use is to say, you know what? This is really good information. I can tell this is somebody you want to get to know better. So then we can talk about how they can make that leap, turn that person who's just an acquaintance into somebody who is a real friend. And as they're making these friends and shifting friends, and I do always share the statistics on shifting friendships with kids, that only 1/3 of friendships last from the fall to the spring of the first year of middle school, that if you ask kids to name their best friend, only about half of those people that they're naming are going to name them back. And if you follow kids from 7th grade to 12th grade, research shows that only 1% of those friendships are still intact. And I share those statistics because it's really reassuring. It reinforces for kids that there's nothing inherently wrong with them. This is just a time of a lot of churn. When you hear those statistics, you can understand why kids want a best friend. They want something stable. They want someone they can depend on, somebody who's really loyal. And I've been teased for how vehemently I am opposed to the idea of seeking out a best friend. And part of that is the obvious reason, which I'm sure is the first one that will come to your minds, which is that if you have one really close best friend, and something goes wrong, you don't have a safety net. You don't have somebody to hang out with. If you get in a fight if that friendship ends. But that's actually not the primary reason I'm opposed to the idea of a best friend. The real reason is that we know from research that the kids who are the most successful in high school are the floaters. And the floaters are the kids who can move between groups, who can talk to anyone, who really can relate to people who are not like themselves. And in middle school, kids are so drawn to people who are just like them. So invariably, that best friend is someone who's very similar to them. Maybe the parents are even friends. Maybe you live in the same neighborhood, play the same sports. The list goes on. But if you're hanging out with that one person, you're not developing the social skills or practicing the social skills you need to be a floater. So we want to really be encouraging kids to branch out and hang out with people who they might not otherwise be drawn to. So just a few more ways to acquire that sense of belonging, to find that place in the pack. First is to really understand how peer pressure works. And there's all kinds of ways, as I mentioned, that kids can find themselves getting into hot water. Maybe they're skipping class, maybe they're vaping, maybe they're drinking with a peer, maybe they're cheating, maybe they lied because they want to be able to go to a party. When you are talking to your kids about peer pressure, it's very tempting to say someone's going to pressure you to do something. I know in my generation, growing up, it was the DARE campaign, the Just Say No, and it was a dismal failure because it was predicated on this idea that somebody was going to tell you you had to do X, Y, or Z, or they weren't going to be your friend. And that's not how peer pressure works. Peer pressure is behavior contagion. And interestingly, going back to the idea of gender differences, boys are much more likely than girls to behave similarly to their same age, same gender peers than girls are. And one of the ways you can really help your kids manage peer pressure is by explaining that you are who you're with. And when we get to Supersight, I'll give you an anecdote that talks about how you can actually operationalize resisting that behavior contagion. Middle schoolers are not known for being the most flexible. And because they're insecure, because they so badly want to please you, their teachers, the coaches, all the other adults in their lives, they can become very defensive when they make a mistake. It can be really hard for them to let down their defenses. And one of my favorite questions when I'm talking to a middle schooler and I know that they played a role in whatever the conflict is or whatever the mistake was, I'll say, I hear you. You always want to start by validating their point of view. I hear you. It sounds like it is really this other person's fault. But if you had to own your 2%, what would it be? And often that's when you get some really good nuggets of information and you can engage in some problem solving with them. That can help them repair relationships that they want to repair, whether it's with a peer or an adult at school or in the sports arena. We also need to teach them the social skills they need to connect with others. And I think there's this idea that when kids hit middle school, suddenly they're too old to be helped with concrete social skills. And that's just not true. In fact, I've had even socially adept 8th grade girls ask me for help entering a conversation or tell me they feel awkward when they're in a group. And I might say something to them like, when you see a group of people who are talking, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go up to them. I want you to just get close enough that you can hear what they're talking about. And then once you know what they're talking about, wait for a pause, ask a question related to that topic. Everyone loves to answer questions. And when you give them those concrete skills, those tools, they actually are more willing to take those risks in the situation. So they really are looking for that kind of help. If you know that your child struggles more than others with social skills, if they're delayed and coming out of the pandemic and years of instability, and in many ways, a lot of kids are about 18 to 24 months behind. So normal might look a little different right now, especially since kids spent a lot of time online. I continue to see a lot of particularly boys who want to socialize primarily online or through gaming, and it's hard to get them off. And you may even need to start by having them invite someone over to game, at least in person with one another, so that they are taking one step forward toward taking those social risks. And we want to make sure that we are aware of where they're getting tripped up. I had one mom share with me a story about her 6th grade son, and he was really popular, had a lot of friends, and she was watching him try to make plans with his buddies. And one of them would say, we should get together this weekend. And another one would say, yeah, we totally should. And then someone else would agree, yeah, let's get together. And eventually the mother realized that she had to prompt him to say, where are we going? When are we going there? And how are we getting there? So making sure that you're still tuned in to what kind of support they need in this group. And going back to the idea of the kids who have fewer social skills, especially kids who might be a lot for one target friend, that adage that all you need is 1 or 2 good friends actually doesn't apply in that situation in the same way. If anything, they might end up driving away the 1 or 2 kids who would potentially be very good friends for them once they have more skills, because those kids end up feeling overburdened. You're actually better off arranging lots of very short, structured social hangout time for them with a wide variety of kids, so that they're not overburdening any one particular person, but they are getting chances to practice their social skills. And then the last one here has to do with not burning bridges. And it's very tempting for middle schoolers when they're unhappy with a friend, when they feel wronged, when they think someone's gossiped about them, to want to get support from everyone else in their orbit, to tell everyone else what went wrong and get them on their side and make a big statement about how hurt they are and how they don't want to be friends anymore. And there's a fine line between being assertive and sharing how you feel one-on-one with a friend and going to that explosive level. So reminding kids that there are lots of different ways to create distance, whether or not it's that you feel wronged or you just need a little bit of a break. And I call it a friendshipification. You can just take a little longer to reply to texts or not make out of school plans. It does not have to be a grand declaration, because what I know is that kids who have a falling out or who don't connect in 7th grade may very well want to be friends again in 9th, and we don't want them burning those bridges. All right, moving on to supersight, which is that ability, again, to anticipate how your behavior today will impact an outcome tomorrow. And I talked about peer pressure, and I talked about how it's behavior contagion. So I'm going to share a little story. I had a student, it was a middle school boy, who was getting in all kinds of hot water when he was part of this big group text chain. And I will never be out of a job as long as there are large group text chains, but they typically do go off the rails. Not much good comes out of 35 people text chains. I'll just put that out there. Definitely monitor them or spot check them periodically, not to get your child in trouble so much, but to use it as a learning opportunity. But in this particular case, the kid was saying racist things, some homophobic things, and it was really atypical for him. It wasn't the way he was talking in school, and even factoring in the fact that there's no eye contact online, it still seemed aberrant. And so I asked him to go through all of his posts, his texts, and find the one that didn't belong, the ones that were aberrant, that really stood out. And once he did, I asked him what was going on. And that's really the question you want to be asking your child. You know, what were the conditions at the time you made that post or text? And for parents listening, I think it's really powerful to do the same exercise next to your kid with your own texts or your own posts. So you're sharing your experiences without lecturing them. And what he realized is that every time he was making those comments, the same particular kid had recently joined the chat. And so he just made one small tweak, which was to get off his phone whenever that person joined the group text chain. And that was enough, as it turned out, to keep him from making those errors. And the reason it worked is partially because he identified what was getting in his way, but also because rather than depending on his instinct or his gut or his ability to just know the right thing to do, we were really finding a way to operationalize it, because middle schoolers have a lot of what I call emotional interference. They might be texting someone they want to impress, or they might be trying to be funny, or they might get caught in a lie because they wanted someone to believe that they had made a team that they hadn't actually made, and it really came from their insecurity. So many things can get in the way of doing the right thing. And by operationalizing it, we give them that framework that takes away the need to lean on their instinct or common sense. Similarly, you can tap into their values. It's a different framework that also can be really successful. The way that I do this with kids is I print out a list of values. I like Brené Brown's Daring Greatly list. It's about 80 or 100 values that cover a wide gamut of different things, everything from generosity to kindness, security, risk-taking, imagination, fun. It doesn't really matter what they choose. The idea is to have them go through the list and choose the 10 values that best reflect the kinds of people they want to be around and the way they want to show up in the world. And after that, what I do is I have kids keep that list. Sometimes I even have them rank it from 1 to 10. And again, this is an activity you can do alongside your child, and you discover what your own values are and have a way to talk about what's important to you without telling them what they should value. And then when they're in a difficult situation, what you can explain is that if they're not sure what to do, or if they want to do a gut check to see if they're on the right track, to look at that list and ask themselves which of the decisions they're contemplating is most closely aligned with their values. More often than not, when I have kids do that exercise and then I ask them, which decision do you think you'd be more comfortable with, down the road, they will tell me that they think they would be more comfortable with the values-driven decision. Inoculation theory is another way to teach kids how to make good decisions. And this comes from a professor at Dartmouth named Josh Compton. It's the idea that you can inoculate kids against bad decisions the same way you inoculate someone against a virus with a vaccine. And here's how it works. First, you preview the scenario that might be tempting and why it might be tempting. Your friends are going to invite you to, vape in the bathroom with them, or invite you to a party where there's going to be drinking or drugs or something that is not aligned with, what you've determined is important to you in those values, in the values you came up with. But you're going to be tempted to do that because it feels good to fit in. It feels good to feel like you're being invited to the parties that you want to go to, that you're social, that you're not going to be lonely. That's giving them the compelling reason why they might be tempted to do something. Or maybe you're curious and you want to just get outside your comfort zone a little bit. And then the second part is to give them a compelling counter argument for why they don't want to do that. It feels even better to be known as somebody who, sticks to their values or who is really trustworthy. Another example, sometimes this will come up with is gossip. It feels really good to have the best story, to have all eyes on you at the lunch table. But, it feels even better is to be known as a vault, to be known as the person who everybody depends on and can trust in a crisis. And the cool thing about inoculation theory is that you don't need to cover every last scenario. You just need to cover enough scenarios that they learn how to think that way. And as I mentioned in that maybe game, so much of this is about teaching them critical thinking skills so that they can make good decisions for themselves when you're not there. And last, but definitely not least, this is a stage of development where their prefrontal cortex, the part of their brain that's responsible for logical, rational thinking, empathy, self-compassion, is not fully developed. It takes longer for the signals to go from the amygdala, or the fight, flight, and freeze part of the brain, to that prefrontal cortex. And once again, we don't want to depend on their common sense or their wisdom. They have very little life experience. We want to do what we can to operationalize it, even if that means suggesting they sit on their hands and count to 10, or pause long enough to ask them 2 questions. Can this come back to haunt me or hurt someone else's reputation? You can even have them sing the alphabet in their head before they post anything. We're just trying to build in that time for them to be able to make those good decisions. Okay, moving on to super bounce, because despite all of the strategies I just shared, they inevitably are going to make mistakes. It's just part of the phase. And we want to make sure that we are giving them a runway back to being a good kid. no matter what they have done, they are still learning, and we don't want them to get paralyzed. We don't want them to get stuck in shame. If they do, they're not going to learn. They're more likely to make the same mistake again. And we need to make sure that we're approaching them with empathy, with a non-judgmental tone, that we are making it clear that this is about them being the kind of person they want to be and not only about our expectations of them. So some of these tips relate to language. One of the phrases I like is, I'm guessing you did that because, I'm guessing you cheated because you didn't want to admit you didn't know what you were doing, or I'm guessing you lied because you were worried I would take away your phone. And when you give them that plausible excuse for why they might have done something, you're not saying that it's okay or that you agree or that you sanction it. You're simply showing that empathy. You're saying you understand. And you can go from there to telling them why it's not okay. Similarly, I bet it felt awful when, or I also would be embarrassed if I thought. It's another way to enter those kinds of problem-solving conversations with them. And rather than saying, no matter how tempted you are, you might want to say, what were you thinking, or what's wrong with you? If you can start with a phrase like, I wonder, or I've noticed you're not comfortable when you're with that particular friend group. It seems like you're much more likely to say something that you're embarrassed about later. Those entrees into these conversations are softer and more palatable. If they sense drama, they're going to shut down. They're not going to have that conversation at all. And then, do you think you are your best self? Do you think that this is how you want to show up in the world? More often than not, I find that kids will answer, no, that isn't. And once I say that, you can say, all right, would you like my help so we can make sure this doesn't happen again? And get that permission before you start offering solutions to them. One of the cool things about teaching kids self-regulation skills is that when they have tools in their toolbox, not only do they have things that they can do when they are dysregulated to calm themselves down, they're actually less likely to get dysregulated in the first instance. They feel more in control. So I wanted to share some of my favorite strategies that I share with students. These are the ones that kids themselves tell me work the best for them. The first one here relies on the science that if you have to come up with language, if you have to come up with words, it turns off the fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain and turns on the prefrontal cortex. So I might throw a ball and say, let's count out loud and see how many times we can get the ball back and forth. I might suggest that they take an object into a testing environment with them if they have anxiety about taking a test or anxiety about presenting, and come up with 3 words to describe that object before they have to speak, just to help them feel more grounded. We want to make sure we're not doing all of the reassuring for them. We want them to learn how to self-soothe. And this was something I struggled with my own one of my own kids. When they were in 8th grade, they would text me right after they took a test or quiz and say, I totally failed. And even though I knew better, I couldn't resist. I would write back, and no matter what subject it was, I would say, well, it's a history test now, and it's going to be okay. And I realized that she was dependent on me giving her that reassurance. And I actually had to say to her, I'm not going to text you anymore. I'm going to talk about it with you after school, not because I don't care, but because I know that you can handle those hard feelings yourself. And let's give that a try and see what happens. And so we both needed to work on that skill in order for her to be able to develop it herself. Activating the parasympathetic nervous system operates on the idea that you can calm your body to calm your thoughts, whereas mindfulness is about calming your thoughts to calm your body. And sometimes kids can't sit with their thoughts. And this was especially true in the aftermath of just so much instability over the last several years. A lot of kids had trouble staying grounded in their bodies, in their chairs. And so I would give them ways that they could activate their parasympathetic nervous system. And the 4 that kids seemed to respond to the most, one was to press the acupoint below their thumb for a few seconds on both hands. Another was to give themselves a tight hug. They can tense and release their shoulders. If they're able to leave the room, they can splash cold water on their face. Again, we're really arming them with a toolbox full of different things that they can do. If they're really worked up, that's not the time to start giving them strategies and trying to reason with them. They're in that fight, flight, or freeze part of their brain. Wait until later. And again, and I know I've said this about 2 or 3 times, but it's so important, ask for permission before you just start offering strategies. And then the last one on this list is to teach them to take breaks from worrying. Nobody can worry 24/7. And so we want to be modeling that for them. My kids might see me write down something I'm worried about on an index card and stick it in the freezer and say, all right, I'm taking a break. I'm putting it on ice. You can use a mini manual paper shredder. You can use a worry box that they drop it into. I've used what are called worry monsters that you can get on Amazon. They're just stuffed animals with a zippered mouth. You can feed your worries to them. I actually got the worry monsters for my younger students, and it turned out the middle schoolers loved them the most. And I think it's because middle schoolers can be 13 going on 3 or 13 going on 30, depending on the day or even the hour. So really just experimenting, but making it clear that if they want to conserve their energy, they can't perseverate nonstop. They have to allow themselves to take those breaks from worrying. Switching to the educators for a moment who are on here, these are a few of the strategies that I really have found helpful in the school setting. The first is the shadow a student exercise. It's from design thinking, and it's a framework for having every educator in a middle school follow a different student over the course of a day. What you discover is not only is it far more exhausting than you probably imagine to be a student, to manage all of the transitions and all of the social risks and the academics and the interactions with so many different kids and adults, but you discover that you may not know the students as well as you thought you might know them. I had one student who was coming to me all the time to tell me that no one liked them, that nobody was including them, that people would roll their eyes when they spoke, that people were turned off by them. And so we were doing a lot of work on social skills. I just took it at face value that that was what was going on. But when we shadowed him for a day, we discovered that he actually was really well liked. He was included in everything. He had people to talk to at recess. He was a part of the action at PE. He was animated at lunch, and people were really interacting with him, which shifted all of the work I was doing with him, because the issue wasn't his social skills. The issue was his self-perception and his confidence, and helping him work on the self-talk and helping him get out of his own way. So shadowing a student was a really powerful way to see how different kids are experiencing middle school, and also being able to support them in various ways. We want to scaffold risk-taking. Risks are far bigger than you might think they are. We might say, well, just go ask the teacher for help, or, just invite them over, not recognizing that for a risk-averse middle schooler, there might be 25 or more steps in between. They might be thinking to themselves, how can I ask the teacher for help? I can't even make eye contact with them, let alone address them directly. And even if I could, I'm not sure I would know how. So what you can do is ask kids to rank a risk on a scale of 1 to 10. At my old school, in one of my first weeks there, I found a bunch of students crying in the bathroom, in the girls' bathroom. And when I asked them what was wrong, it turned out they all had to give this tiny TED Talk, which was a 3-minute speech about their identity. They had to memorize it. It was on videotape. It was very personal. It did sound very scary. And when I asked them to rank how risky it was on a scale of 1 to 10, they're middle schoolers, so they said it was 150. There was no such thing as just a 10. And then what you do is you ask them to identify a risk in the 4 to 7 range. And the reason I choose that 4 to 7 range, and this works at home too, is because you want them to be doing something that is challenging enough that they can prove to themselves that they can get outside their comfort zone, but not so risky that they are likely to fail and have their amygdala fire danger forevermore. When I asked the kids to come up with that 4 to 7 range in that public speaking situation, they actually came up with ideas that were pretty creative and maybe not ones I would have come up with on my own. In fact, one of them said that they would be fine giving the talk with their back to the audience, which to me sounded about 1,000 times worse. But we want to make sure we're not making assumptions about what will work for them. And the last one on this list is a coping jar. And this is something parents you can do at home as well. It simply involves taking a mug or a jar of some kind, ordering some blank popsicle sticks from Amazon, and brainstorming in the classroom ways that kids can self-regulate, things that work for them, brainstorm strategies, have all of the students write different ones on that stick. When I do this, I ask them to write the strategy on one side of the stick and on the other to write down when they used it and their initials. And what I'm trying to do is reinforce this idea that coming up with coping strategies is like throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. We never know exactly what will work, and the same strategy that works in one situation may not work in a different situation. So that's something that the teacher can contribute to as well. You can contribute to your own strategies. And when students are struggling, you can remind them that they can grab a strategy from the coping jar. They can try an adult strategy. They can try their own, maybe a classmate's. And we're really normalizing that everybody needs to lean on different strategies at different times, and that asking for help, seeking ways to self-regulate is normal and just part of everybody's navigation through a school day. Optimism. And when I started talking, I talked about how optimists see things as situational and temporary, and pessimists see them as permanent and pervasive. What we really want is for kids to understand, and this is sort of a mind-blowing concept, but this idea that we have no way of knowing if getting what we want is a good thing or not. Middle schoolers are so sure that if they want something, it's catastrophic if they don't get it. I had a scenario come up in my own household. It's a story I shared with his permission, with my son's permission, in Middle School Superpowers. He was so eager to get his braces off. The orthodontist kept telling him that soon those braces would be off. And every time we went back to the orthodontist, he would say, you know what, I'm really sorry, buddy. We need one more visit. But on one of those visits, toward the end, he said, I'm positive that next time they'll be coming off. So he was really excited. He thought for sure this was the time they would come off. But when we went to that appointment, sure enough, once again, the orthodontist said, you know what, I really had thought this would be the time, but you still need a few more months. So he was really dejected. He was worried he'd have to go to high school still wearing braces. But then a few days later, he went to baseball practice and he took a ball to the mouth, which banged up his face and also dented his braces. So back we went to the orthodontist. And the first thing the orthodontist said when he looked at him was, I'm so glad we didn't take the braces off. They were the only things that kept your permanent teeth from flying out of your mouth. So again, we have no way of knowing if getting what we want is a good thing or not. And that's something we want to be imparting. We want to be sharing our own mistakes, our own setbacks, and maybe how they redirected us, maybe how they benefited us. There's research showing that when families share oscillating journeys of other family members, so maybe there's a grandfather who started a business, but then the factory burned down, and then they had to switch to a new industry, but found success in this new industry. When we share those stories of resilience, our kids are more resilient too. So we don't want to be glossing that over. Otherwise, they think your life was a straight line from 7th grade to success, and that does not serve them. We also want to make sure that we are reassuring them that the stakes are low. So with older adolescents, brain development is farther along. The synapses are starting to connect more. One of the ways that looks different in younger adolescents is that when they think the stakes are really high, when we're really impressing upon them, that this could have a long-term effect on your future, rather than actually working harder or caring more, it tends to backfire. It just has to do with brain development. So we're better off helping them see the stakes as low, even if we see them as fairly high. And for the most part, everything can be fixed in middle school. This is a time when we want them to understand that things are low risk, that all risks are low risk at this point in time. We want to make sure that they don't get so bogged down in what they perceive as their weaknesses that they are, self-flagellating, that they're really hard on themselves. One of the ways I do this is by sharing stories of people who used their perceived weakness or their actual weakness as a hidden strength. There's an example of the founder of IKEA who was dyslexic, and so he came up with visual instructions, and we know how that turned out for him. With students, when I ask them to come up with 2 strengths for a weakness, I had one student who had ADHD, who was down on himself for being disorganized, for being called hyper by friends, and he realized that he brought a lot of energy to classroom discussions, that other kids would take more risks because of him. So it's all about that reframe and making sure they understand that everyone is a mix of those strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes we have to get them out of their own head entirely. We want to make sure that we are giving them opportunities to help other people. We want to make sure that we are lightening the mood, whether you're exchanging animal videos, which I did basically throughout middle school with my youngest on TikTok. I have never seen so many animal videos in my life, but that was a very easy way for us to connect. And also it was low stakes for him. It was a way for him to just share with me. I recently learned the term pebbling, which is when penguins leave little rocks for one another as a gift. And in many ways, I see those exchanges of videos or links as the same idea as pebbling. And then we want to make sure that we are controlling our own anxiety. And that might mean connecting with other parents to normalize that everybody in this age group is messy. Everybody in this age group is still working on organization and social skills and talking to adults and having face-to-face meaningful conversations. These are all skills that are emerging. Empathy is still developing. We want to make sure that we are not in a vacuum so that we can present as calm and optimistic to our kids, because emotions are so contagious. And that is really how you plant those seeds of hope. When I talk to middle schoolers, I often will share some common myths about the phase with them, because I want them to think about the phase in a positive way. We know that kids who go into middle school optimistically, who don't expect it to be a phase to dread, actually have a better experience. So I remind them that it's not that they crave drama, it's that they, again, need some help in figuring out when they need to extricate themselves from a situation and when they have to be involved. And parents and adults hold myths about middle schoolers as well. One of the most common that I hear from parents is that my kid is embarrassed by me. And that's actually not true. They're embarrassed to be with you. And there's a distinction. When I wrote my first book, Middle School Matters, I devoted a chapter to advice from older teens and college students who were close enough to the middle school phase that they remembered it, but far enough away that they could look at it a little bit more dispassionately. And one of those interviewees shared a story about a time in 8th grade when she was invited to a football game at the high school. And she was really excited. She was going to be meeting up with older kids. She was going to be independently attending this game. And her dad excitedly said that her mom and him would join her. And she really didn't want him to. He eventually decided to go anyway, just not with her. It was in a town where lots of people would like to go to the high school football games. And at the game, even though they weren't together, he saw her and waved to her and said hello. And she kind of turned her back and didn't acknowledge him. And he was really hurt. And what she told me was that she was upset that he was upset, but that he was misinterpreting the situation. She just wanted to be seen as mature. She wanted to have that independence, and she viewed the presence of her parents as getting in the way of transmitting this newfound maturity that she wanted to transmit. So really understanding that about them and giving them that space to grow. Another myth is that they don't want to talk to you. They actually very much want to talk. It just has to be on their terms, which means not necessarily when you would like to, but rather maybe at 10 o'clock at night or when you're finally sitting down to do your work, and really try to be able to attend at that moment, because those moments tend to pass and you want to seize them when you can, especially in middle school. And the last one here is that they're trying to push your buttons. It can seem very much like they're trying to push your buttons, but actually, as I tell parents, when they are, hammering home a point that is aggravating to you, they're actually just trying to find out what mysterious thing is going on in your head or what you think about something. And that's a sign of respect. They care what you think. It's actually when they stop trying to figure out what's going on in your head that you need to worry. If those moments where you can have those conversations are far and few between, and you want to make sure that you can seize on them, there are certain ways that you can facilitate getting that conversation started. One is to talk about things that they want to talk about, talk to them about things that they're experts in, that having them share things that they're interested in. You can boost their confidence, ask them to talk about things that they like about themselves. They can even list them, or ways that they think they contribute to the school culture, or things that they think other people would say they like about them. If they're perseverating about some perceived slight or something that they did that they are embarrassed about, you can help them forecast how they might feel later. It's called temporal distancing, but ask them how they might feel about a problem in 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years. With middle schoolers, it might even be 5 hours can change everything. I talked about how important it is to remind them to ask for help. Also, you want to be reinforcing that when they ask for help, that they're asking an adult, especially if it's a big deal problem. Their peers can't handle it. And what we don't want is a 7th grader asking a similarly impaired 7th grader for advice or support, when, if anything, they might actually make it worse or prevent them from getting the kind of specialized help they might need. And the last one on this list is about talking to them about potential situations that might come up. If they open up a little bit about parties or temptations that have come up at school, whether somebody's asked them to borrow their homework, or could be anything. If it relates to drinking, giving them, brainstorming some refusal phrases, things like, I'm not into that, or I have a really big sports event tomorrow, so I can't. When you have those conversations about scenarios and ethical dilemmas with them, you also can present some of your own. If you're having a friendship problem of your own, ask them for advice. That levels the playing field a little bit. And one of the things that we know when it comes to communication is that when you talk to kids as if they're a little bit older than they are, a little bit more mature, when you have high expectations, when you treat them as the expert in their own lives, as someone who can contribute wisdom to you, they actually do better. They are more likely to rise to the level of your expectations. Relating rather than teaching. Teaching is when we tell them our behavioral expectations, where we tell them what we want them to know or what chores they need to do. And that's what we all do 90% of the time, whether we're educators or parents. We want to make sure we are giving them time to share with us as well. If there's a topic that is going to potentially be triggering to you, it's okay to outsource it. I had a mom who had issues around food and would get in arguments with her child if she took a second helping. She eventually realized that those conversations were better left to someone else who didn't have as many issues around food, and that is okay. You don't need to be everything to your kids at all times, and sometimes it's better to outsource the difficult conversations. We also don't want to be only talking about those high yield conversations, grades, the future. Just checking in, knocking on their door, asking them if you can support them in some way can be incredibly powerful and can open the door to those conversations that end up being surprisingly revealing, even if they start as very casual. And make sure that your tone, the words you choose, that your body language, that they're all in alignment. So if you tell your child that it's okay if they get a C, if you know they worked hard, and they get in the car after school, or they come in the door after school and they tell you they got a C and they're really dejected, and you say, no problem, it's over now, there'll be another opportunity. I know you worked hard, only you waited for a full minute before you responded because you were checking an email. All your child is going to remember is the pause, and to them it will feel inauthentic. So really taking the time to make sure that you're conveying exactly what it is you want to be conveying. So just going to quickly share a couple of resources that I like. These are some websites you can check out that relate to mental health, that relate to teen support. I want to share I did work on creating an app called the Congruence app. It's a self-coaching, voice-activated app for teens. If you're interested in a free subscription for a month, the instructions are there. You can email service@congruence.app. If you mention Operation Parent in the subject line, you'll get that full month. It's something that I did because I was being asked all the time to create a workbook for kids. And while I knew parents might buy it, I was really skeptical about kids actually wanting to fill it out or do the exercises in a workbook. So this is more teen friendly. And then I want to share a few books that touch on a lot of the themes that I've talked about today. I could have created a much longer list, but these are some of my favorites that you can check out. And I'm going to turn it back now to Michelle, who will do the book giveaway.
All right. Thank you, Phyllis. That was amazing. Thank you for that deep content and so many things to think about. And so we're super happy for parents to dig into more of your advice. I loved your book, The Middle School Superpowers. I read it and I also listened to it on Audible. I noticed on Audible too, you've got questions for some book club studies and things like that, which I thought was just amazing. So we're honored to give away 3 copies of your book. And so folks that would like to be entered to that, you just need to click here and enter on the pop-up your full name and mailing address. And we will take it from there and then draw the winners right at the close of the webinar today. So we're taking questions for Phyllis right now. I do have a couple to get us started, but we would very much love some more. So go ahead and put your questions in the private chat and we'll entertain those. This is how you can reach Phyllis directly. So these are all of her social media handles, as well as you want to check her website out and the QR codes on her book as well. We invite you to think about getting Phyllis's books as well as an Operation Parent Handbook bundle to just get a power start to your school year. Okay, so this gives you an idea of the topics that are covered in our handbook. Just a couple of them: mental health, friendships, sleepovers, bullying. That's at the elementary level. We also have a middle and high. So looking at the teenage brain, effective communication, as well as parties and sleepovers. Many things to think about as a parent. We're very excited for you to think about the variety of topics that I just mentioned to you in our handbook. You can use this pop-up to look at them more closely, but there are Spanish editions and Christian editions available as well. We have parents, grandparents, foster parents, as well as drug-free organizations all over the country utilizing our handbooks. We encourage you to think about getting one for a really strong start to your school year. And speaking of middle schoolers, we also have our TNT program. So Allie and Carol are our community advocates, and they are available to talk with you more about our TNT program, which we're going to offer a pop-up for you to check that out next and utilize the QR code. When I talk to you about our middle school TNT program, that is a prevention programming bundle. It's a full package for you to put on a prevention program in your community. And when we tell you more about that, we also have a video that you can look at if you want more information on that. Okay. So we're going to tell you a little bit more about those things at the end of our presentation, but we're going to get to the questions now. So our first question is from a parent who has adopted a child, and they would like any suggestions you have for helping them think about consequences, even with little things.
So one of the things that I talked about a little bit today was giving kids a runway back to being a good kid. And so when they make a mistake, you want to make sure that they understand exactly what it is that fell flat without getting them stuck in that shame. And something that comes up a lot in middle school in particular is lying. Middle schoolers will often lie in order to get out of an issue or making a mistake. And so if there's a mistake that involves both an action but also a lie, make sure that you're separating out the two, and that the consequences for whatever it is that they have done make a lot of sense. And so if they break a vase and they lie about it, you want to make sure that you are addressing the lie differently and separately from that broken vase, because you want to make sure that you're underscoring the values that are important to you as well. And then if they make a mistake, that consequence that is logical might be something like, let's say they lied about where they are, then you're going to be pulling away some freedom because they can't be trusted. And the flip side is that if they're doing things that show that they can handle a certain amount of independence, continue to give them that independence and maybe even more independence so that they can see the upside to doing what's expected of them as well.
Oh, that's so good. Here's another great question. How do I help my middle schooler who gets emotional when she doesn't please others or feel like she's making someone else feel down? Also being open to constructive feedback from teachers, staff, parents, etc.
Yeah, so that child sounds a little bit like the perfectionist I referenced in this talk. And I think one of the broader conversations we want to be having with kids, and girls tend to struggle with this more, is to find out what it is that their expectations are. Is your expectation that you're never going to argue with this friend? Is your expectation that a teacher is never, ever going to tell you you need to study this a little bit more or write another paragraph? Because what I have found is that middle schoolers often hold very unrealistic self-expectations, and they're so busy shooting for the moon, they miss whatever it is that they have accomplished, or missed entirely what it is that is appropriate for them to expect to be accomplishing. I like to use the metaphor of a ladder and draw the rungs on the ladder and imagine what it is that they want to achieve at the top of that ladder, and then break it down into lots of different steps. That works better with academics than with pleasing a friend. And then once they've come up with those different rungs on the ladder, which they often need a lot of help coming up with, even adding another rung and breaking it down further. But you have to first figure out what it is that they're afraid of, because you can't target that underlying fear if you don't know what is leading to it. So is the fear that that friend will reject them entirely? Is it that everybody is going to reject them? And then you can have a conversation with them. Well, what's the most likely outcome? What's the least likely outcome? And after having that conversation, how do you think this will turn out? Really helping them appraise situations a bit more realistically.
That's so neat. It's kind of like pulling back the layers, like a little bit at a time to get to the center of the issue there.
Yeah. And perfectionism is really just fear of an unknown outcome. So you have to figure out what's driving that fear.
Good point. Good point. Our next parent is asking for some insight on appropriate consequences for rule breaking.
So it depends on the rule that was broken and what happened. I guess I'm going to answer this without any additional context. If the rule is that they cheated on a test, in a school setting, let's say, you would hope that the school would give them a 0 and then make them retake it, because you want them not only to have the consequence for not doing the work honestly, but you also still want them to learn the material. And so if you apply that to whatever else is going on, if they lied about having a phone in the room, then the consequence might be less phone privileges. Or if they lied about where they were, they may need to they may not be able to go out with as much freedom as they had before. They may need to check in more often. So really thinking about what it is where they went wrong and what would make sense for them to understand, and not having it be a forever thing, giving them an opportunity to earn back your trust.
Oh, that's so good. Just have the consequence match exactly what's going on. I love that.
Otherwise it won't be memorable. It won't make as much sense to them.
Less of an impact, right?
Yes.
So, okay, this is a tough one, but advice for teens that have lost a friendship.
First, loss of empathy. It can feel like heartbreak. It's really hard, and there is not a lot you can do about it in the moment. It takes time to pivot. If you can see it coming, you can start encouraging them to fan the flames on other friendships that they might have kindled, but just not to the same degree, so that when it happens, they're not completely adrift. But that again can take some time. And one of the ways kids tend to dig in their heels is that if they're dumped by a friend they really want to be friends with, there's nobody else that they want to be friends with. That's a response. There is nobody else. That is the only person. And then you can talk about finding just right fit friends for right now. This is not a forever situation. I went through this with one of my own kids, and she's now 21 and will say that the friendships she was forced to pivot to are her closest friends, like lifetime friends. Again, it was kind of a hidden blessing, but it didn't feel like that at the time. And giving them a space to really just feel the feelings. Emotions are like a tunnel. The only way out is through, and that's really hard. And it happens to everyone. It's why I always share those statistics I shared in this talk on friendship, so that kids know that it is not because there's something wrong with them. And also reminding them that some of these friendships actually cycle back in when you have something in common again.
Good point. They all cycle around, and it is so hard just to see your teen when they're hurting, to logically think through, okay, the best way to help them and get them to sort of reroute. It's hard. It's really hard to see your own kiddos hurt.
Yes, and if you can convince them to extend an invitation to someone they think is struggling even more than they are, just getting them out of their own head. Is there someone who is new to the school or who you think could use a hand? Why, again, that right fit friend for right now, could it be win-win? And encouraging them to think beyond their own situation.
Yeah, that's great advice to help them, move forward. Okay, how do you support a high-strung child with a high need to get most of their needs met? So here's a little bit of context.
Yes.
Something they may do is get aggressive or verbal with their tones if it's not going well or their way.
So, number one, you're the thermostat or the thermometer. So even if they're going, up to here, you want to make sure you're staying on an even keel, because those emotions are contagious. You may need to take a time out yourself if they're unable to self-regulate in that moment. Do not try to solve any problem. I'm a big fan of finding something that's a distraction, that's a bit sensory. I had a client who would flip out during homework and get really stressed during homework and fight with her father and want him to give the answers to the homework. And he would get frustrated and they would end up fighting with each other and words were exchanged. And instead, he took a bit of a break. Maybe he would ask her to help him, knead the dough for pizza if it was pizza night, but something that was a bit sensory that distracted. And once they're calmer, that's when you can have a conversation about why that wasn't okay and how they might be able to self-regulate better in the future. And also recognizing some of this there's hormones coursing through their body. They're dealing with so many things. Sometimes they really are struggling to self-regulate. And the best thing you can do is just not go up there with them as well and stay calm yourself and model that for them.
Wow, that was a great reroute and save by a dad, recognizing let's reroute and adjust. And oftentimes after school, they're so tired. They value that break and time to just kind of recharge. And
Yes.
I love what that dad did to just reroute it.
Well, it was very unpleasant for him for a long time before he tried something different. But I would agree with Michelle with what you just said, that so many students, when they come home from school, they're exhausted, they're emotionally exhausted. They just need to decompress. And you don't need to badger them with questions about their day. Just give them that time to recover and recharge.
Oh, that's awesome. So good. Okay, how can we help our teens through FOMO?
So for those who don't know what FOMO is, it's fear of missing out. Variation on that is FOPO, which is fear of other people's opinions, which also comes up a lot. So FOMO is very real, and you want to put in as many safeguards. So if you know your child is really prone to FOMO, have a conversation with them where they're doing the problem solving. Do they think they would feel better if they were not, sitting at home online, looking at what everyone else is doing on social media without them? Would they maybe feel better if they invited somebody over to occupy themselves, even if it wasn't their first choice plan? If they tend to compare themselves to other people, again, social media can be pretty corrosive to their self-esteem, but helping them brainstorm what they think would help them, avoid those feelings. I've had kids who've done things like set a timer for how long they can be on certain apps, or avoid certain apps, or turn notifications off on certain apps, or have one of them put an app on their phone that reminded them to take a few deep breaths before they did anything online. So having them partner with you on coming up with those solutions, and just validating that it feels really bad, and you would imagine they'd want to come up with some way to avoid feeling that way.
So good. So good. So for a parent who has a child that internalizes things, what are some questions that you recommend to help with the opening up?
Low yield conversations to start. So I will never forget a 7th grade student I had who said, "Can you please tell parents not to say to us, 'Are you okay?' Because when they say, 'Are you okay?' we feel compelled to answer, 'I'm fine,' almost instinctively. But then if we're not fine, we feel like we've missed our moment." So they're in their room, knock on the door, "Can I get you a snack? Do you need anything?" Having those just low pressure check-ins, that downtime to do something fun or funny or family movie or play a game or take a walk. When you strip away eye contact, it's often easier to have those conversations, and making it clear they're not going to get a dramatic reaction no matter what they say, practicing your poker face so you're not reactive. Often kids who keep a lot inside are afraid of the reaction they might get if they shared what was going on.
Good point. Give them a good, even-keeled, safe space to unload, right?
Yes, I will share in Middle School Superpowers, I share a story from a principal who told me that the best strategy ever that this mother came up with, who had 4 teen sons, was at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night, without any kind of announcement, just bake cookies or brownies, and as if they were in a trance, the boys would come downstairs when they smelled the baked goods and sit at the table, and suddenly they'd have these conversations. So if you have to get creative, you can get creative too.
That's right. Another good strategy. Baked goods can always help, for sure. So we have a child with self-esteem, 10 years old. The self-esteem issues are around weight, and having a healthy relationship with food. But self-esteem tips that you might have for this mom?
Yeah, I actually see that with a lot of 10-year-old boys who are just about to have their growth spurt too. So having a conversation if they're insecure about puberty, about how some of these changes are very typical prior to that, going through puberty, and so things would change. Not focusing on food and diet and exercise, just focusing on, first of all, other things entirely, but also just doing things together, taking walks, staying active without it being a big loaded subject. And that is related to that tip I gave about what are some hidden strengths and these perceived weaknesses. I'll share a story. This was a group of, it was actually 10 and 11-year-olds. It was a 5th grade classroom. And I had the whole class do that exercise. And I first said, what are some things that kids in this age group might be insecure about? And this one brave boy who was overweight raised his hand and said, I think some kids might be, worried that they're too big for their age. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, anyone have any ideas for some hidden strengths? And this really sweet, quite underweight girl in his class raised her hand and said, well, first of all, you'd be the first person I'd want on my tug of war team, which was very cute. And then she said, I'm actually worried that I'm too skinny and that I look too young for my age. And the same boy who she had just reassured said, yeah, but you can get through really tight spaces easily. So they sort of twisted themselves into a pretzel to make one another feel better, which is something that I appreciate about the age, but also just reminding them that everyone is insecure about something. Nobody feels good about absolutely everything, and focusing on their strengths, just taking that strengths-based approach rather than continuing to have, tons of conversations about the one thing that they don't like.
What is your advice for parents and athletics? So starting sports, what's a good way to start those sports and keep them positive and keep self-esteem high for those parents who are starting or continuing athletics? What's some of your advice for them?
Yeah, I think there's been such a shift in the culture towards specialization, toward spending an enormous amount of time and all 4 seasons on the same sport, which we know leads to overuse injuries, which we know leads to burnout. We know kids who do lots of different sports actually are more successful in their chosen sport later than those who specialize really early. So trying not to pile on the pressure, trying to choose the appropriate level of play for the kids. So if they're not great at something, but they love it, rather than saying, yeah, maybe you shouldn't do that because it's not your strength, just having them play in a rec league instead of a really competitive travel league. I think one of the things we forget to tell middle schoolers that they end up having faulty ideas about is this idea that you can do things you like even if you're not good at them. And you can quit things you don't like, even if you're good at them. So really giving kids permission to explore different things, to shift, to try things that they're not necessarily good at without any judgment from us. And again, going back to that idea of setting realistic expectations, one of the things I've seen, especially with boys, that awareness of that their changing bodies isn't there yet. So you might have a kid who's really insecure because he didn't make a team and he's not as strong or as athletic as his classmate. And I'm puzzled because to me, looking at the two of them, it's obvious that one of them is prepubescent and the other one is 75 pounds heavier and 6 inches taller and has gone through puberty. Of course they can't compete against one another, but that's not intuitive to, a young adolescent. That's something we actually have to point out for them. And then I'll also add, especially for kids who are easily discouraged, this relates to the question we got earlier, keep some kind of a log of how they're progressing. If it's sports, it might be that you're taking video, showing how much better they are over the course of a year or two at hitting a baseball. It might be the same with music. If it's art, maybe it's a portfolio. But making sure that you're pointing out that progress, no matter how incremental. Otherwise, they might just conclude, I'm not where I should be, and so it's all for nothing.
Oh, that's awesome. And that helps too, because you get a wide variety of coaches in your athletic journey. So if you hit a tough coach, you can use that progress to help keep their confidence up while they're working through those things. So switching gears, a parent would like to know how to deal with a teen who complains about chores, tasks, all the things that are day to day.
Yes. I thought you were going in a different direction. The kid who has a problem for every solution. I call them the Eeyore kids, like the donkey. That's a different variety. The thing with chores is that, or any expectations, you want to set them in advance so that you're not negotiating every time in the moment. And you want to be clear in advance what the consequences are for not doing those things so that you can very dispassionately and in the moment say, oh, well, you didn't do this, so you can't do this. Or this can't happen because that didn't happen. What you don't want, because it's exhausting for you and gives them the false sense that these things are optional, is to be negotiating at every pass for every activity that you expect them to do.
All right, that's amazing. I'm going to pull one more question here for you if you're up for it.
Sure.
Okay. So a parent is asking, what might be some of your recommendations for very young kids, 2 to 8, like maybe some resources you like there, and resources for emotion and life skills type things.
Yeah, the confidence code for girls is great. And there's a workbook that, a younger kid might be more willing than a middle schooler to actually do some of the exercises in a workbook, but that's a good one. The book that I listed in the resources by Katie Hurley, the Stress Busters, she also has a workbook that is a companion for kids that they can do that I think is appropriate for younger kids as well. I can't think of any others offhand right now. Yardsticks just helps you understand the phase better. Sorry, my phone is ringing. It never rings unless it's spam.
Yes. Okay. I do want to tackle one more question. This one is more serious. I work in a residential facility with teen girls, 12 to 18. My girls seem to struggle with self-harm. So this is due to bullying. However, that's just a little bit of context, but any thoughts about helping teens through self-harm?
Yeah, they're going to need some specialized, support for that. They need replacement strategies because really, cutting is their attempt at coping, at eliminating the pain by distracting themselves with a different pain, which is obviously not, the right adaptation, but they need to know what they can do in those moments. There are therapists that specialize in that, and I would definitely try to nip it early. It's a habit. Habits are, by definition, not going to get better without interrupting them. So you want to make sure that you're getting in there and giving them that support and those alternate strategies as soon as you notice there's an issue.
That's tough. Thank you so much for that advice and additional encouragement. So a teacher, this is our final one. There were so many great questions. I think I got to most of them, but for any of you that I may have missed your question, please forgive me. There's a lot of interaction and great stuff going on in the chat. But a teacher would like to ask you, what is your favorite resource for teachers in the classroom to build on some of this advice that you're giving us?
So in Middle School Superpowers, at the end of each chapter, I have a whole section for educators that tells teachers how to use the actual strategies I talked about today. I write these books as much because I work in a school. I write them as much for educators as I do for parents.
Yes, that section of the book was awesome. So I encourage folks to check it out. I'd like to close this afternoon. This will conclude the Q&A, but I did want to let folks know a little bit about our social media posts that we have, and invite you to join our vibrant social media community. Our social media handle is at Operation Parent across all of our platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, as well as LinkedIn. And we've been so honored by the number of people that are sharing and tagging us there in our communities, and telling us how families and drug-free coalitions and other folks are using our resources across the country. It's been so neat just to see that vibrant community grow virtually. And then also just wanted to let folks know there's a pop-up for our webinars that we'll put back up for you. And so this gives you quick and easy registration for our September the 9th webinar. So if we can't get this pop-up to come back up, just please forgive us for that. You can go to our website and register for the September 9th webinar with Dr. Michael Rich. He's with Boston Children's Hospital and the Digital Wellness Lab. So that again is on September 9th. We'd love to have you back for that one. And then up on our website, we have the October webinar also available, and that is some more information on digital wellness with Dr. Sad here, the Chief Adolescent Medicine Doctor at the University of Kentucky. So we've got that registration live up on our website, and then November webinar will arrive on the website tomorrow. And that one is to help parents begin to talk to young children about good decisions related around alcohol. It's very appropriate for children of all ages. There's just a sweet children's book that we're gonna have folded in to that webinar that we'd like for you to know more about. So again, we're gonna close here today, and we're gonna, after the close of this webinar, we're gonna pick 3 very lucky people, Phyllis, to get copies of your book, as well as some samples of Operation Parent handbooks. So we can't thank all of you enough for joining us this afternoon. And Phyllis, thank you for everything that you put together for us today. And we will see everybody very soon on September the 9th.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good rest of the day.